ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Pope Francis has died. The Vatican announcing his death on Easter Monday. He appeared in St. Peter's Square to bless thousands of people on Easter Sunday, just hours before his death. He had been increasingly in poor health, including spending a lengthy time in hospital with pneumonia. The Catholic world is now in mourning for the 88-year-old who was elected in March 2013. He'll be remembered for the progressive, no-frills approach he brought to the Church. Today, Vatican Correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter, Christopher White, on Pope Francis's life and legacy. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Chris, what a sad day for the Catholic Church. Across the world, millions of people are mourning the death of Pope Francis. So let's have a look at his life, at his legacy. Pope Francis was elected back in 2013, and Chris, it became very clear very quickly that his style would be very different. He was to bring a progressive approach to the Church.
When Pope Francis walked out on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica just, within an hour after his election, there was a signal that this was going to be a new sort of papacy.
His election marks a series of firsts. The first Francis, the first Jesuit, the first South American, and the first man outside Europe to be made Pope for more than 1,000 years.
He had foregone the traditional red velvet cape and shoes, and he walked out with a simple white cassock.
The
work of the conclave is to give a bishop to Rome. It seems my brother cardinals went to find him almost from the end of the earth. But here we are.
And for him, I think it was an intentional signal to show that he wanted a church that was identified with the poor. Just a few weeks after that, during Holy Week, he broke church law and washed the feet of women and Muslims at a Roman prison. And I think we saw from his early actions a pope intent on prioritizing the marginalized. And he understood very clearly the power of symbols throughout his 12-year papacy. He often spoke through gestures and symbols before he even began to speak and teach.
Yeah, incredible. And of course, he became Pope really late in life. He was 76.
That's true. I think his election was a surprise to everyone, including himself. In 2005, in the conclave that elected Pope Benedict XVI, he was the runner-up. So he was certainly a known figure in 2005, but I think most people had counted him out in the conclave of 2013. I think there was probably an understanding that he might be a kingmaker and an influential voice behind the scene, but few people thought that he would emerge as the king himself.
Yeah, and despite his age, from all accounts, the energy that he put into his work was truly extraordinary.
Yes, I've had the pleasure of traveling with Pope Francis around the globe over the past few years, and in every continent, from a mass with 1.5 million people in the Congo to a mass that drew half the country in Timor-Leste. These are moments where the Pope came alive. He often said that being inside the Vatican was like being in a prison for him. And he was happiest when he was outside of Vatican walls, connecting with the average person on the street, with the people. This is a man who really throughout his life shunned the trappings of power. He really resisted any sort of notion of clericalism or elitism. And he was a commoner. And I think that was, for many people, one of the reasons why he captured their imagination.
Yeah, and he travelled so widely. And in 2015, he delivered a really defining speech to the US Congress, didn't he? Tell me about that.
Yes, Pope Francis became the first pope to ever address U.S. Congress.
I am most grateful for your invitation to address this joint session of Congress in the land of the free at the home of the brave.
And he really challenged everyone in that address. Of course, the U.S. Catholic Church has a strong history for its pro-life stance, but he pushed them to make sure that wasn't just about abortion, but also capital punishment. He certainly made a strong case for migrants.
We, the people of this continent, are not fearful of foreigners, because most of us were once foreigners.
And of course, climate change. Just a few months earlier, he became the first pope to ever publish a document saying that the Catholic Church accepted the scientific consensus on climate change.
Mr. President, climate change is a problem we can no longer be left to a future generation.
Pope Francis saw these issues as all interconnected. He said everything is connected, from issues regarding human life in the womb to capital punishment to migration to climate change. He saw them as interlinked as a defense of human dignity. And so when he stepped in the halls of U.S. Congress, everyone was challenged.
Yeah, and that is a message completely at odds with what we see Donald Trump doing now, and he certainly was not silent on Donald Trump before his death.
No, that's true. I mean, back when President Trump ran for the very first time on the campaign trail in 2016, he was asked about, what do you make of then candidate Trump's proposals to build a wall between the U.S. and Mexico? And the Pope was very blunt. He said, look, those who build walls and not bridges are not Christians. And then later in Trump's second term, he identified what the president was doing on the U.S. border and his efforts of mass deportations of migrants as a crisis. And he called on all Catholic leaders to stand as a bulwark against that. That was one of his, final acts, was to write this letter to U.S. bishops, effectively rallying them against the Trump administration's mass deportation plans.
And Chris, Pope Francis, he worked really hard, didn't he, to make the Catholic Church far more inclusive. There are more women in the Vatican today than there ever was before, and that's because of him.
I think Pope Francis, recognized early on that for the Catholic Church to have a credible voice in the modern world, it needed to look differently, it needed to sound differently. And I think he led by example by inviting a number of women to take leadership roles in the Catholic Church. Even from his hospital bed, he made an appointment to name a woman as the first ever governor of Vatican City State, the highest administrative position in the Vatican. Now, his critics would say he didn't go far enough. Women cannot serve in ministerial roles in the Catholic Church. But I think it's certainly fair to characterize him as a reformer on this front.
All right. Well, Chris, let's look then at perhaps some of the controversy that occurred during his time as Pope. His progressive ways, of course, were not welcomed by everyone, were they?
No, I mean, Pope Francis, by making the church more welcoming to LGBTQ Catholics, by emphasizing the need for women to have a central role in the life of the church, and really by recognizing that Catholic lay people, not just priests and bishops, needed to have a say in their church, he upset the apple cart. I mean, it's throughout his 12-year papacy, there were those that were quite rankled by these reform notions and sought to undermine Pope Francis because of them. They saw him undoing centuries of tradition in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and of course a huge problem for the Catholic Church has been its handling of historic child sex abuse. How did he handle that? How is it perceived now?
When Pope Francis was elected in 2013, the Catholic Church was still reeling from the clergy abuse crisis. And, I think he was elected on a mandate to clean up the church. And it's very fair to say he got off to a rough start on this, most notably in his native Latin America. Cases in Chile, a neighbor country to his homeland of Argentina, that he really dismissed outright as calumny. And then he did an about-face. After being presented with the evidence, he wrote an apology saying that he was wrong. And in 2019, he issued a major reform law that for the first time properly held bishops accountable for not just abuse, but the cover-up of abuse. That being said, he has changed the law, but it is still lacking teeth and taking effect. So 5-6 years after that, the culture still has not changed. And some would say that ultimately the buck stopped with him and that he needed to do more to prioritize this issue.
Were there any other controversies that stood out during his time?
I think, one of the things that Pope Francis certainly will be remembered for is the way in which he spoke about geopolitics. Many people saw the Vatican's stance toward China as perhaps too forgiving toward China's human rights abuses during his papacy. On the war in Ukraine, Pope Francis often made comments that could have been interpreted as siding with Russia, that of course upset Ukraine at numerous points. Now, the Pope repeated often that Ukraine had a right to self-defense and to their own self-determination. But he also was keen to see a negotiated end to that war. And Ukrainians often thought that the Pope was too dismissive of their concerns about their own sovereignty. So when it came to the realm of international politics, it was and is a thorny and complicated terrain.
So, Chris, of course, there will now be 9 days of mourning for Pope Francis, but let's turn to who will replace him, to the conclave. Just explain that process for me.
The conclave, as anyone who has seen the recent Hollywood film knows, is the most secretive election process on earth. The next pope is chosen among the Church's College of Cardinals, the roughly 138 men from around the world who the Pope has chosen to be cardinals, to wear red hats and to be his closest collaborators. And upon a death or resignation of a Pope, they elect among themselves the successor. And this is a process that happens behind closed doors at almost every stage. It begins through a series of meetings called general congregations, where for about 10 days, cardinals meet and discuss what they want to see in their next leader and what the church needs in this moment in history. And then they proceed into the Sistine Chapel, where the doors are locked, and over a course of several days, or it could be several weeks or months, there's no sort of timeline. They take multiple ballots a day, again, all behind closed doors, to elect the successor to Pope Francis.
So it can be a relatively quick process, but it could take a really long time as well, by the sound of it.
In the modern era, popes have generally been elected in 2 to 3 days. But as any historian will tell you, we have records of papal elections going on for months. Now, it's inconceivable that would happen today, but it's not out of the realm of possibility.
Okay, and a candidate needs to receive a 2/3 majority, right? So what happens if that doesn't occur?
Well, the way the rules of a conclave are written, there gives a lot of latitude for votes to go on for a very, very long time. The idea is to achieve not just a simple majority, but a supermajority. And each pope in the modern era has reformed the rules of a conclave of how a new pope is elected. Pope Francis never did that. There was much speculation that at some point he would, but he never did. And so this is a process that he has not, in fact, left his stamp on. And the College of Cardinals will abide by the rules last modified by Pope Benedict XVI in 2013.
All right, so tell me, Chris, is there a strong feeling about who could or should be the next pope?
This is a very difficult question to answer.
Yes.
I don't know who I would advise anyone to put their money on. Pope Francis, in naming cardinals, really kind of broke the mold there. He prioritized elevating voices from pockets of the world that had traditionally not had cardinals. And in doing so, he elevated churchmen to the spotlight that don't have massive profiles. So many of these men that will be entering the Sistine Chapel to vote on the next pope are unknown figures, and they don't know each other very well. And so it's going to take some time for them to really sort of suss each other out, to figure out where everyone stands. Now, of course, there are some names that frequently float to the top. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, he's the Italian cardinal who served as Pope Francis's Secretary of State, is often mentioned as a possible front runner because he was such a visible presence during the Francis papacy, and he goes into the conclave with name recognition. Pope Francis, of course, was a magnetic, charismatic figure, and Cardinal Parolin is a very quiet and reserved figure. And so I would say the case against Cardinal Parolin is many people would see him as someone lacking the mass appeal that Pope Francis has and that many people believe a pope should have. So he's often floated as a front runner, but by no means a sure bet as the next pope.
Yeah, all right. And of course, before all of that, we will have Pope Francis's funeral. Even that, Chris, will be a far simpler affair, won't it? A reminder of the way he led.
Yes, just about a year ago, Pope Francis modified the rites for the funeral of the Pope. He really wanted to strip down the liturgical ceremony to make it much more simple, to not overly glamorize the position of the Pope. Past popes have been laid out in St. Peter's Basilica, where people could, walk past and pay tribute to his body. Pope Francis did away with all of that. He's actually not even going to be buried in the Vatican, becoming the first pope in about a century not to be interred in the Vatican. He's actually chosen to be buried in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. This is a papal basilica on the other side of town that he was always fond of. He would go there and pray before and after every time he traveled abroad. And in fact, he went there after each hospitalization to give thanks to God for preserving him. And so this pope, who's often been viewed as a maverick, in death is going out as an outsider, by his choice of being buried outside the Vatican walls.
And Chris, in your view, what's his lasting legacy?
I think Pope Francis will be remembered as a pope unafraid to bring the church into dialogue with the modern world, the world around it. He made the church a less hierarchical, less clericalist institution that aimed to prioritize and respect the views of all of its members, not just those in collars.
Christopher White is the Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Cara Jensen McKinnon. Audio production by Sam Dunn and Adair Shepherd. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.